Hello everyone, this is Mark and I'm going to be reviewing our solar install, our current solar install, and then talk a little bit about what we're going to do to expand our solar install with a few more panels. So we'll get into what we have currently and then show the new stuff to come, and I'll be up on the roof showing you all that and how to install the new panels. So before we get into that, let's do a quick overview of what we have. And I'm going to jump from our whiteboard here into some live pictures. And as you can see, here's our current install with our 21 panels on the roof. And if we move over to this section, this is the place where we're going to add our 3 additional panels. So the current panels are on the southwest facing roof, and the new panels are going to go on our southeast facing roof. Obviously, the southwest facing roof has a lot more surface area, so we've been able to put a lot more panels on there. Okay, so if we go back to the whiteboard here, we can get a view of what we're doing. I'm going to do a quick overview of what we have, and I'll get into a lot of nitty-gritty details on a lot of the parts and installation and some of the gotchas and tricks that I found worked well with this install. So again, here's our 21 panels here, and the 21 panels we have are the Hanwha Q-Cells, and they're the G6 Plus at 340 watts. We've got 21 of those. We've got 2 strings of those going into a solar deck. That's the item that goes into the roof. It allows you to put a hole through the roof and flash it nicely so no water gets in. That then transitions down into Romex cable, which goes into the Envoy combiner box by Enphase down here. From there it goes into the disconnect, then into the panel. Then we have our net meter, and then it's out to the grid. So that's the overall view of that. And then our new install is going to have 3 Jinko 400 watt panels on it. And we might be able to expand that to 4 panels. We have maybe a little bit more room, safe room to add another panel up there, but currently we're going to go with 3 panels, and that will then be wired down into the combiner box. All right, so let's start back here and let's get into more details on what's happening with our current 21 panel install. So as far as when you do your layout, we went with a designer based down in Florida, and the designer gentleman did a satellite image of our roof and then said, looks like we can put about 21 panels on the southwest facing roof. And really the restrictions there are some setbacks from the various ridges of the roof line. So here's the roof line here along the top, and this might be just a North Carolina thing, but it might be span additional states, various setbacks. So you need a 3-foot access. So if there's a fire, firemen can get up the side of the roof. So the panels are set in at least 3 feet from the edge of the roof, and the same thing along the ridge line. The panels need to be at least 3 feet down from the top, so you can walk along the top of the roof line there. So given that and those setbacks, and then we also have a valley here in addition, so you have to be, I believe it's 18 inches from the valley, from the edge of the panel. So that allows us to put in 21 panels here. So we decided to go with the Q-Cell G6s, is that, again, for sizing considerations, the G6 Plus is a 60 cell panel. And 60 cell panels are a bit shorter than 72 cell panels, so we're able to put 2 rows of those panels into here for our install. So that's one of the reasons we went with that over a 72 cell panel. And if you look a little bit closer, the G6 panels are what they call a split cell panel. And what that means is that the panel actually, instead of having 60 cells, it actually has 120 cells, and they're called split cells. So there's 60 split cells on the upper half and 60 split cells on the bottom half. And the split cell is simply the cell cut in half and put into these different regions. So the nice thing about that, if you do get maybe some shading in this area here, the upper panel is going to still pump out 200, or once it goes to the inverter, 240 volts. But it's still going to output the same voltage but less amperage. So it really does well kind of in a shading environment, and also from trees or, of course, clouds going by. Okay, so those are the panels that we're using, and a little subtlety here. There's the G6 and there's the G6 Plus panels. Please hold. And so the difference is the G6 Plus panels have a 25-year warranty and a 25-year power warranty. The the G6, the Hanwha Q-Cell G6 panels have a 12-year manufacturer's warranty and a 25-year power warranty. So little subtlety there if you're looking into the Hanwha panels. If you can get a hold of the Plus series, that has a little bit better warranty than the non-Plus series. Okay, then jumping into our microinverters, we're using the Enphase IQ7 Plus microinverters for the Q-cells. And the reason we're going with those is that those are rated at 225 watts. And the panels are rated at 340 watts. So I think one of the things that I was looking into while researching and looking at this is like, well, that's not good. The microinverter can't handle the wattage of the panel. But we've had, from our experience, we installed these in May and now we're in November right now. And from what we've seen thus far is that generally the panel is rarely going to generate more than 295 watts. So a 340 watt panel, based upon the angle of the roof, the directions it's facing, this is a south-southwest facing roof, is more often than not, we're not going to hit that limit. We've only hit that limit probably about in May, probably about 3 times. And we look at the graph, what happens is that you can see the power come up in the morning, and the normal graph kind of comes around, the sun of it is at its apex, and then it starts to drop down as the sun starts to set. When you get clipping, when it hits that 295 watts, so the panel gives off more than 295 watts, on those beautiful sunny clear days, you get a graph that kind of looks like this. It flattens out at the top. So if the microinverter was a little bit, could handle a bit more power, you would get this little bit of extra energy along the top there. And so the question is it worth going with the next microinverter up, which in this case would be the IQ7A, which is rated at 365 watts, but it's probably about $25 more, or $25 to $30 more per inverter to go with the IQ7A versus the IQ7 Plus. So from what I've seen, this little bit of gain that you're maybe getting 10 times out of the year where you're getting this clipping of the power, I don't think it's worth it to, you're not going to, maybe this ends up to be over the, a 10-year period, it ends up to be, let's say $200 gain, $500 gain, something like that. I don't think it's worth it by extrapolating the curve there for that. So if you are going, I would say if you're going up to maybe a 350, 360 watt panel, the IQ7 Plus is probably fine. Probably panels above that, I would go into the IQ7A, which is actually what we did for our new install, which I'll get into in a second. Okay, so those are our microinverters there. And another part of the discussion is, which version, what do you go with? Do you go with microinverters or inverters by Enphase, or do you go with a SolarEdge solution with what they call, they have their own terminology for their little connector points here for SolarEdge. I'm forgetting what that is right now, but basically with SolarEdge, they have a centralized inverter here, so all of the power going down to where your panel is, that's DC power going down, and then it gets converted into house power right at that centralized inverter right there. Versus the Enphase solution, these microinverters here, they actually convert it right to household power, aka 240 volts is what's coming out of here, rather than DC power. So we decided to go with the microinverters over the Enphase solution over the SolarEdge solution, mainly because we were thinking about expanding down the road. And I think if you're thinking about expanding your system down the road, it's very easy to expand an Enphase system where you don't need to then resize your SolarEdge inverter. Let's say you've got a 5 kilowatt system and you have a 5 kilowatt SolarEdge centralized inverter, and then you're like, oh, let's add another kilowatt or 2 kilowatts. you then need to get a brand new, higher powered centralized inverter there, whereas with the Enphase systems, you can simply just add more panels, additional microinverters, and wrap it right down into your combiner box. So I'll get into a few more details about that, but that was our solution. Both are really good solutions. I don't think you can go wrong with either one, but so we went with a microinverter Enphase solution. So even before all of that happens, how do you mount the panels on the roof? And so we went with the XR100 rails by Iron Ridge with the Flashfoot 2 quote unquote feet. And so we have basically 2 long runs of rails going across for the upper row and 2 long runs of rails for the bottom row for that. And then we've got a whole bunch of feet that are positioned along the rails. And I'll show you a diagram. I'll actually pop that up in the video here. Is that as part of the engineering plans, we live in the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and we do get a lot of wind. And so in the engineering of the connecting the Iron Ridge rails to the feet, there's actually feet spaced pretty close right near the edge here, because we're rated at a class 3 wind zone in this part of the house. That then drops to a class 2 wind zone a little further in, and you'll see from the diagram that the feet can then be spaced a little further apart as you get a little bit further down the roof. So from a magic calculation and a computer, it came up with that, and so we went with that plan of the number of feet that you need to have to support the rail in high winds. So if you are doing your own system, make sure you get a proper spacing of your feet, of where you are, the type of winds you might get and things like that. So we need to be prepared for hurricanes and whatnot here, for all that stuff. Okay, so we first laid out the rails, and when I show you our new install, I'll get into how the feet go down, how the rails go up. I'll have a whole video on that part of it. But once the rails are down, the panels then get mounted up onto the rails. But even before that, you actually put in the microinverters first, and then you wire everything up even before the panels are there. And as far as the wiring goes, when you order the panels, or the way we ordered them, they actually gave you with a whole run of cables for what we call a portrait design here. What that means is that you can either order your cables whether you're laying your panels on the side in landscape mode or in portrait mode. The only difference is that the cable is shorter in portrait mode because it just needs to go a shorter distance, whereas if you had the panel on its side, the cable length between connectors is longer since the panel's on its side and hence longer. So here the connectors get all connected together with the Enphase cable, and then the SolarEdge, which is the kind of common way to, if you're going through your roof and to wire the items into your attic, is a SolarEdge is a nice flashed feature piece that allows you to prevent any water from getting in as you drill a hole in your roof to route the cables in. So our SolarEdge is actually located under the leftmost panel on the top row here. So there's actually a panel here sitting over the top of that, and that's really for aesthetic reasons. You don't actually see it there. So the 2 lines, we've got 10 panels on this line here and 11 panels on this line. So each of those lines come into the SolarEdge. So here's 11 panels. Line comes into there. The 10 panel line comes into here, and then it converts from the little connector here that converts those 2 lines into Romex cable. So the nice thing about the Enphase design is that once you get inside the house, you can run standard household cable, aka Romex cable. Whereas if you use the SolarEdge system, you're running DC power through the lines, and you need to have that all needs to be put into conduit. So a little bit more of an install when you're actually wiring a SolarEdge system versus an Enphase. So since this is Enphase, we do our Romex cable. The initial specs actually called for a 12 gauge Romex for each of the lines going down. When we chatted with our electrician in doing this, he said, it doesn't hurt, run a 10 gauge, you're probably gonna get a little less voltage drop if you run a little thicker gauge wire down to your combiner box, which is located outside. And this run is 85 feet from the roof all the way down to our combiner box is here, and I think that was a good call to go with a little bit bigger gauge cable, in this case 10 gauge, 2 conductor cable with 1 ground going in. So we have 2 of those going down, 1 for each line, 1 for the 11 panel string and 1 for the 10 panel string heading down. So those lines then come down through the house, and then they go back outside to where our combiner box is. And I'll bring up a picture of that on the screen. So that's the combiner box. And we're using the combiner box version 3. It's called the Envoy. And in that combiner box, there's ability to handle up to 4 lines coming in, and each line can be up to 20 amps. So you can actually have 4 different lines of solar cells feeding that. So in our first install, we used up 2 of those. We had 2 20 amp breakers there coming in. And to rewind a little bit here, one of the common questions is how many panels can you put on one string that gets you down into the combiner box? And what Enphase says, if you're using the IQ7 Plus microinverters, you're limited to up to 13 microinverters in one string. And so that math comes out to be, I have my little cheat sheet here. If we do our math, so if we have, I'll pop it over here. So if we have 295 watts, that's the max power that the IQ7 Plus can give off, times 13. That comes out to be 3.83 kilowatts. If you divide that by 240 volts, that will give you the amperage, and that comes out to 16 amps. So that's the max that they recommend for that. And then if you're using the IQ7A microinverter, that handles a bit more power. That goes up to 365. And Enphase says if you're using those in a string of panels, you're only allowed 11 of those, and that math comes out to be similar. So if we multiply that by 11, the max of 11, that's 4.01 kilowatts. And then divide that by 240 volts, gives us our amperage, and that's about 16.7 amps. So you can see how they scaled it for that. They don't want you to go above that on your lines there. So little takeaway there if you're deciding to add a bunch of panels in. So if we did expand this, so let's say we had the roof space to expand our current southwest roof, we could add 2 more panels to this string and 3 more panels to this string to max out the 20 amp breaker that's in the combiner box. Okay, so all those come down to the combiner box. Within the combiner box, that also has the Wi-Fi, which allows the combiner box to chat with the Enlighten app, and that's where you get all your neat graphs and power readings and all of that, and system health, system functionality is all done via the app. I'll get into the app, at some other point. I think Enphase's software is okay. It's not great. I think their hardware is really good, but their software could use some work. I'm a software guy, so just seeing some of the things they do seems a little odd and not completely logical. Anyway, we move on. So that's a combiner box. Once it gets all nicely combined in there, it then comes out into a disconnect. This is required probably in most states to have a disconnect. So if there's a fire at your house and the fire department comes, they can easily turn off the disconnect, which then depowers the entire system. So the way that works is all of these microinverters, they're sensing household power. So when you're connecting the system in, if there's no household power coming into the system, all the microinverters shut down. And so that takes sometimes a little time to understand. You're thinking, well, all the power is getting generated here and being pushed out. There's actually power going up through the other direction and telling the microinverters whether household power is on or off. If household power is off, all the microinverters shut down and there's no power going through the system. Okay, so we go from our combiner box through the disconnect, and then that's where we then jump into the panel. And in our house, we have 400 amp service. and it's broken into two separate 200 amp panels. So we went into one of our panels, and a few of the notes here to understand is once you get wired into your panel, they want you to put the circuit breaker for your solar in the upper left-hand corner of your panel to be separated from where the actual power comes in on the panel. And I have a note here. Yeah, so the inverter breaker must be at the opposite end of the breaker box to prevent concentration of the current at one end of the bus bar. So what that means, if you had the circuit breaker down here, now you have a concentration of the power coming in from the power company and the power coming in from the solar, thus possibly overloading the bus bar. So that's why you keep them separated like that. So upper left-hand corner of your breaker, of your panel here. And then, of course, the power comes out to your meter and then out to the grid. When you do your install, most meters that they install at your house are not a net meter, and so you need to contact your power company, and they'll ask you about the number of panels you're installing, the power and all that, and then they'll send someone out once your system's installed. This is the case for here in North Carolina. They'll then switch your meter over to a net meter, and then that will sense power going in and out. So if you're consuming less than you're producing, you're going to send power out to the grid, and the meter's going to go backwards, and then the meter will go forwards, of course, during the nighttime and times where you're consuming more than you're producing from your panels. A couple of notes on kind of the net meter is that when you first get your meter and the sun is out, it's going to read 0. Let's say it has 4 digits on it, 0, 0, 0. Right when you turn on the power to your panels, you're probably going to be using your power. Your panels are going to be exceeding the power you're consuming in your house. And this is actually going to go backwards. Actually start to go backwards to 9999. Don't let that fool you. You're not consuming that much energy. That actually means -1 kilowatt hours you've actually put into the bank. So if your meter is reading 9999 something, that's good news, because now you're in the negative and you're not getting charged by the power company for your power. Good. And then also on these little digital meters, if you look at the meter, on our meter, there's 3 little black LCDs. And if the LCDs are blinking to the left, as basically if this one turns on and then that turns off, and then the left one turns on, and then that turns off, and the next left one turns on, that means you're pushing power back to the grid. So if the dots are moving to the left, you're pushing power out to the grid, which is a good thing. That means you're creating more power than you're consuming. If the dots are moving to the right and cycling that way, that means you're consuming power, consuming more than you're producing for that. So that's on your meter. Okay, so let's see, a few more notes here. So again, 21 panels. We've got 21 panels, so that's a total of 7.1 kilowatts of power coming from the panels, but effective power is not 21 times 340, it's really 21 panels times the max that the microinverter can create, and that comes out to be 6.2 kilowatt. 6.2 kilowatts for our system, and again, you're rarely going to have that clipping point here, maybe only on perfect days, since the power of the panel might once in a while exceed the power of your microinverter. Okay, and let's see. Just checking my notes here if I want to cover a few more things. Oh yeah, so down back here at the panel, here's another fun thing to understand and figure out, and I'll put a link down in the description of a good site I've gone to that explains how to size this properly. So when you look down here, so we have a 200 amp panel and we've got a 35 amp breaker here. So the rule of thumb that you need to go with is that if you open the door on your panel, there is a rating there that says max bus bar amperage. On our panel here, the max bus bar amperage is 225 amps. What is required for this is that the breaker for the solar plus the power coming into your panel, the max power, which is 200 amps, which in that case would be 35 plus 200, so 235 amps, can't exceed 120% of the bus bar power. So if you take this and multiply by 120%, I believe you get 270 amps. So we're fine here. So we could actually go up to, almost double our size and still be within the realm of what our bus bar supports. But you might have, in your case, you might have your panel might be rated, your bus bar might be rated at 200 amps. If it is rated at 200 amps times 120%, that would put you at 240 amps. So the max you'd be able to put in is a 40 amp breaker, which is probably around an 8 kilowatt system, 7 to 8 kilowatt system. So that's the math you need to do as far as the size of the breaker you need to put in for your panel setup. The next thing is, well, how big should my breaker be for my panels? And the rule of thumb there is you need to be 125% above what your panel amperage is creating from the microinverters. And so in our case here, we're creating, probably don't have my notes there, but we're creating probably about 26 or 27 amps there, times 125%, puts you around that 35 amp breaker. And so that's how you're going to be sizing your breaker here. It needs to be 125% of the max power that you're going to be creating. Obviously, you're probably, you're going to rarely hit max power, but of course, for safety concerns, that's the number there. So as we add our additional set here, we're going to need to upgrade our breaker to a higher breaker, since we're going to be adding some more panels. All right. The last thing on our install, which again is a little bit of a twist, which you might have as well, is we also have a gas generator. So when we built our house about 5 or 6 years ago, we were really thinking about solar. At the time, we had probably a few more trees around the house, so it really wasn't on our mind. So I was like, oh, let's get a gas generator. Of course, since we live here on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, hurricanes, a lot of power outages, and things like that. So we have a gas generator. So the gas generator is then attached to a transfer switch, which then feeds into the panel. The key here is if we just had one panel and we had a gas generator, when the power went out, the key is you want to turn off your whole solar array when the power goes out. The problem is, if the generator was connected to that same panel, the generator would come on, and then the panel and the microinverters would think that we're still connected to the grid because, oh, we've got power. But we don't have power, and so there's no place for the panels to dump the power. They can't push it back to the grid, the massive quote-unquote battery bank out there on the grid, and that could create some serious problems with the generator on and the panels attached to the same, and your microinverters attached to the same panel. So the way we handled that, since we have 400 amp service, we have 2 separate panels. So we connected the solar array into the panel that's not powered by the generator. And so when you look at our other panel here, we have actually most of our lights and refrigeration on here, and on this one, we have, I think there's a heat pump here and a couple of other things that aren't used as much, but most of the things we need when the power goes out are on this panel here, and that's fed by the generator. So for us, everything was fine. By putting on this other panel, if the power goes out, this panel will totally shut down, which will then tell the microinverters to shut down as well. The generator will come on, kick the transfer switch on, which then feeds our other panel, and then most of the things that we have running that are connected to the panel, of course, will come on. And so, again, the subtlety here, if you had all of this on one panel, you'd probably have to go with a different solution of not wiring your solar array into your panel. You'd probably do like a separate box outside of your panel to connect your array into for that. But anyway, just a side note on generators and connecting that into your system. Okay, so let's talk about what we're doing for our new install. And so when we initially sized our system and we looked at our power consumption, we sized the system to be about 80% of our power needs. And that's with the 21 panels here. It's very interesting, the kind of the psychological nature as once we put up our panels, my wife and I are very energy conscious and conservative as far as turning off lights and things like that. When the panels went up, we even actually got even more focused on, hey, maybe for this load of laundry, I'm going to line dry it rather than put it in the dryer, because the dryer is one of the main culprits in your house that sucks up a lot of power. Power company loves the old dryer. So it's very interesting kind of psychologically when you put up panels, even though you're probably energy conscious to begin with, become even more energy conscious as you start seeing the power you're creating from your own house. But that being said, so we scaled our initial system to 80%, and so we've decided to expand it to our southeast facing roof, and that roof has a lot less surface area to it. So there we can install 3 panels. So since it's a smaller roof, we wanted to maximize our power coming out of there. So we decided to go with higher power panels. So in this case, we went with the Jinko 400 watt 72 cell panels. So those panels are about 79 inches tall versus these panels, I forget exactly what these are. I think maybe these are 68 inches tall. So kind of a taller height panel. But the Jinkos also do that split cell design so it's really 144, 2 times 74. And half of the half-cut cells are on the top half of the panel, the other half are on the bottom, and again, helps with shading and whatnot. So that's, I think, a nice design. So similar type panel, we went over there, higher power. But since we went with the 400 watt panel, we decided to go with the IQ7A. I should say, instead of plus here, this is the IQ7A. And that is rated up to 365 watts. So on probably the best days of the year, which for us are probably going to be in that May, June timeframe, we'll probably get some clipping here where we'll get a little bit of power and maybe flatten out the curve a little bit for those 10 days or so, because these panels can create 400 watts and this can max out at 365. Will be interesting to see. I bet we'll maybe have probably a few days where we actually get that clipping effect, but not an issue at all. So I think that's a nice pairing, going with the IQ7A, handling up to 365 watts and the 400 watt Jinko panel. For this install, and I'll get into the details, we've got a bunch of videos up on the roof of getting this installed, but just from a circles and squares and diagrams and using the whiteboard here, we just needed to have 2 iron ridge 14-foot rails, whereas over on this side here we had multiple 14-foot rails that are connected together with a connector over there. But here, 2 iron ridge rails and then 8 feet. So 8 of the flash foot 2s. So one near the corner here, another one 32 inches in, another one 48 inches in, another one 32 inches in for that for the feet. And then same thing over on our first install, a solar deck, which sits under this panel on the left here. So we've just got one line going into there, and then one Romex line, another 10 gauge Romex line coming in. And since the combiner box can handle up to 4 different lines, now we've got 3 total coming in. And since this is giving off less power, we put a 15 amp breaker onto that line here. Nice thing about expanding your system, then you don't need to do anything else. You know, everything's all set here, it's all connected to the panel. We're simply expanding the system and leveraging the ease of the microinverters and connecting into the combiner box for that solution. A few other notes here. The pitch of our southwest facing roof is 512. This roof over here on the southeast roof is a 712, probably a little bit better pitch for when you're talking more off-season type things in fall and winter where the sun is a little bit lower. It's going to radiate a little bit better sunlight onto the 712 roof over here versus the 512 roof for our southwest roof. Good, so I think that sums up what I wanted to cover here on the whiteboard, and now let's get going and get this new system installed. Okay, good morning. Beautiful fall morning here, and we're going to be installing 3 additional panels, which is going to expand our system to 24 panels. We currently have 21 on the roof. Just want to go over some of the materials we've got here. Of course, we've got our 3 panels. Those are the Jinko 400 watt split cell panels. So it's a 72 panel, but the cells are split in half. So it's 2 sets of 72 for a total of 144, which is good for shading and other things like that. So we'll get into that more later. And then we have our 2 rails back there in the blue plastic. Those are 14 feet long. And then coming over here, we've got our solar deck. That's going to allow us to pass the cable into the roof and have a nice secure weather fitting for that. So we're going to show the install of that. And then the rails will be mounted on these flash feet here. And so I'll give an example of how that's installed on the asphalt shingles. And then we have our cable here. It's pre-cut, so it's got 3 connectors here for the 3 panels. And then coming over here, get a little bit of sun on this. This is our IQ7 microinverter. We've got 3 of these, and this is rated up to 365 watts. And then we have our various mounting hardware. So these are the bolts that allow us to attach the panel to the rail. Then we have our grounding bolt for our grounding wire. And then we have 3 bolts, 1 for each microinverter. And then these bolts attach the rail to the flash foot 2 using these guys here. And again, we'll get into the details of this. These pop onto here, and then these bolts will attach the rail to the bracket. Like that. All right, so I think we've got everything we need up to the roof. Okay, we'll do our tapping here. Hear a difference. Kind of right there. So an important part of peeling up the shingle is when I initially did this on the other roof, the shingles are really glued together, so I actually dug into the second layer rather than just pulling up the first layer. So it's important just to get the first layer and not accidentally dig in to the second layer with a hammer or something like that. So this takes a little time, especially in the sun. It's kind of been glued down quite nicely. So make sure you get that first layer and don't use a hammer and dig your putty knife into that second layer there. So we got our first layer up. We're just going to use our pry bar here to go a little further up, and then we'll slide in the flash foot and look for some nails in there. All right, off we go. Okay, so we on our first photo, of course, we did our first mess up. Went to the left, or center one there, and the actual rafter was to the right. So we're just going to fill that with some Loctite polyurethane roof flashing, and then we're going to put a nice bead around here to match where the bolt goes in onto the flash foot 2. Then we'll slide it in and screw it down. Okay, so we have our first 4 feet in. Now we're simply going to screw on the rail mount like that. Actually, it clicks in 2 different directions, so that's for vertical mount, and that's for horizontal. Peter. Not when I'm in the shadow here. And foot, and then screw. And we're mounting them on kind of towards the right edge, so basically I'm doing 10 inches in from the edge of the panel. The edge of the panel is that mark, and 10 inches in. This makes it nicer if the microinverter is near the edge of the panel for wiring and wire timing for that, rather than keeping it in the middle. So here's the SolarEdge wired. We have our line coming in, our Romex cable, and then we've relabeled white to red, black is black. There's our ground going to the ground bar, and then our line coming in from the new row of panels, red and black. There you go. All right, now it's time to install the panels. This is certainly a multi-person job to get the panels up onto the roof and into position. And as you're putting them into place, just be very comfortable. You're wearing the right shoes and all that fun stuff. For these panels, they recommend the panel be placed on the rail. The top and bottom rail needs to be 16 to 19 inches between from the top and the bottom. And so as we put the panel down here, I've put a mark on the panel of from the top and the bottom of 16 to 19 inches. The first panel really kind of tells the tale of where all the panels should go. So you start with that one, and then you pretty much lay the panels so they're in line with that panel. If it does start wandering a little bit and your measurement starts to get off a little bit of where you've marked the panel, you can always adjust the one panel up and down from the next panel from between 1/4 and 1/2 inch as you go along in order to keep that proper spacing. In this case, 16 to 19 inches above that rail. So in this case, I liked having someone hold the top of the panel and then leaning it up, and I kind of rested on my bottom leg there, and then attach the cables to the microinverter from the panel and then put on a whole bunch of wire ties. This is really why you put the microinverter towards the outer third of the panel, such that you can easily attach the wires and wire tie them into place. Okay, and then when you get your ready to screw down the panel, I'm using a Ryobi impact driver here, and I found that setting number 2 on the impact driver gives the right amount of torque for the bolts that are holding down the panel. And I do have a torque wrench, so I did test that. And so if you have an impact driver, rather than using a torque wrench to constantly torque everything, which can sometimes be difficult, leaning over and grabbing and, getting on top of the bolt, I found that if you can test your impact driver for the proper torquing based upon different settings and play around with that, you can just use the setting on the impact driver, which saves a lot of time and makes the process go quite quickly. So right now I'm attaching the bolts that are sandwiching the panels together, and then when I get to the end bolts, there's actually a spacer that goes on there. Since you don't have another panel on the outside to sandwich the washer of the bolt that goes down, they give you this spacer that you put the bolt into, and so that really creates a sandwich in this case on the right side, and then the left side of the bolt will hold the panel down. And so make sure when you do get those that they are sized to the depth of your panel. They sell different ones based upon the panel depth. So all these different panels out there have different depths, and there's tons of things. You want that to be the proper depth so the bolt seats itself properly onto the spacer. And then really at the end of the process, like to just look under the panels and make sure all the wires nothing's dangling, hitting the roof, which is, if you do see that over time, you definitely need to, try to get under the panel, try to wire tie it and things like that. Might be tough if you have multiple rows and the panel that has a loose wire that's scraping against the shingles is not in a good position. So you can maybe find some tricky ways. I did find with one of my panels on the other array, one of the cables was dangling down. It was tough to reach by hand, so I actually put some tape on the end of a broomstick and kind of pushed it in there, and was able to push the cable to stick against the bottom side of the panel to get it off the roof. So far that's held. If that drops off, I might think of a better way to handle it. Okay, so at this point, we're all connected, and down to the disconnect, we'll turn that on and then add these 3 panels to the Enlighten app.